session, Why and How to Teach Church History to Children, will be presented by Mrs. Christa Petzold, who is a pastor's wife, mother of four, second-generation homeschooler, and author with Concordia Publishing House. Please welcome Mrs. Petzold.
All right. Hi, everyone. So I'm just going to tell this. So what we're going to do today, there's some handouts over there if you were able to pick them up. I don't know if you really need this, but I really like to take notes. It's helpful pay attention. So I always make handouts. Basically what we're going to do today is talk about why I think it's important to study church history, and I'm going to tell you some personal stories and how I think about church history and how a greater understanding of church history has impacted me personally. Then we're going to get practical for the end and talk about how to teach church history. And I'm going to share a little bit about the book that I wrote for kids called Journey Through Church History, and like how I conceptualized that and how I laid it out and that sort of thing. So that's kind of what we're going to be doing. To introduce myself, I'm a homeschool mom. My oldest kid is going into 7th. So I haven't gotten all the way through, but, and my youngest is 5, I've got 4 kids, and so I'm working on it, and it's hard. I was homeschooled as a kid, but I was very easy to homeschool. Mother of all 3, like I was one of those kids who I just get up in the morning and start doing my work, and like race to get it done, like before mom was ready for me if I could. So none of my kids are doing that. I promise, but I'm sure they're lovely, so it's great. Anyway, so about, I don't know how many years ago, 6 or 7 years ago, I started writing books. I always wanted to write books. My husband went to the Synodical Convention as a pastor, and one of the resolutions they passed that year was to produce more resources on sexuality and marriage, because there's a need for that. And so we had a Bible study that we were teaching together at our first call, and based on Dr. Bierman's class from seminary that he had taken. And so he, right after they passed that resolution, he went up to the editor at CCLE and was like, I have a book for this if you want it. And so I was like, I don't think we have time to write books, honey. And I was like, we have to do it. It's important. So we did that one together, and then I discovered that I like writing books a lot. And so then I just kept writing books. So my next book, Gathered by Christ, is on the beauty and necessity of church in a world that devalues institutions. So what are the gifts that Jesus gives us in through the church? And that was kind of the content for that was drawn out of my master's thesis studies. And then I also write distinctively Lutheran fiction. So I've written the New Augsburg trilogy, which is sort of a future set. It's like an intentional Lutheran community. Think like the Benedict option as a thought experiment, if you've read that. But it's like, people kind of describe it as like Jane Austen meets light dystopian. So if you like romance novels, dystopian, Lutheranism, and those things, you might like it. So, but anyway, let's get started. So why and how to teach church history? I saw a study years ago that said something like 7% of Gen Z attend church weekly. I really wanted to find that stat so I could cite it for you, but I can't find it. So I don't know if it's true or not, but it's kind of true-ish. Like we know this intuitively, right? That a lot of people in the current the generation that our kids are part of, the majority of their peers are unchurched. And so part of what we're doing when we do classical education or homeschool or like think really intentionally about how we educate our kids is that we are raising them to be weird in a good way. Like we want them to fit in with a culture that's not the predominant culture that our society is in today, but a culture that is bigger and that has more roots and longevity. And so I feel that church history is a very important part of that puzzle and of painting a picture for our kids of where they fit in the culture of the world, that they're not actually that weird, that they're part of something that has some normative aspects, right? It stands the test of time. So I've got just some simple bullet points why study church history? First, it reminds us that today's challenges are not new. For me, there's always a personal connection for everything. Everything is personal. So when you see the state of the world and the church, it's rough. Sometimes it can be easy to be discouraged, but the more church history you read, the more you're like, oh, this happened before. Or, oh, somebody else dealt with this. And so it grounds you and it keeps you from sort of worrying about things. All the challenges that we see in our world have been seen in some way already. It helps us avoid falling into the errors that the church has already addressed. This is sort of obvious perhaps, but the church fathers dealt with heresies. They developed theology. They taught. And the more we know about what they taught, the less likely we are to fall into the errors that they address. It provides examples of faithful men and women to learn from and imitate. So this is important, right? Giving role models and people that our kids can look up to, and especially people who have lived in settings where it is not easy to be Christian, or where they've had to sacrifice or suffer for their faith, so that when that happens to our kids, they know that they're not the only ones, and that they can be inspired knowing what good things came out of being willing to suffer in the moment for the church, that they will be equipped to make those choices too. It helps us answer challenges and questions posed about Christianity, both from within Christendom, like from other faith traditions, like denominations, and also from the rest of the world, right? And then also it's the story of what the Holy Spirit has been doing for the past 2,000 years, which I think we should care about, because the Holy Spirit came at Pentecost and has been at work constantly since then. And we should be very interested to hear all of those stories of God's faithfulness. Okay, so yes, one of the reasons that I homeschool my kids is, among many, is so that I have the opportunity to be the one to introduce them to big topics, right? To those big questions out there when something comes up for the very first time and they see something and they're like, what is going on with that? I want to be there on the scene soon so that I can frame it for them, so I can teach them my worldview and how to think about those things. And we always think about that when it comes to things like sex and relationships and politics and religion. But history is really the same. It's no different. It's part of that. As kids grow up, they're going to encounter teachers of church history, both from within Christendom and from without. So somebody will teach your kids church history at some point, whether by omission or explicitly. It will happen. And so I think it's great to do it proactively. This is kind of personal story time. I knew very little of church history beyond like the Reformation, and then isolated stories of like one or two individuals that I happened to read a biography about or something in school. And sometimes, like, I remember I had a family member who like started getting really into church history, and I have another family member who said they were worried because they were afraid that the more somebody studies church history, they might like go to Rome or like the East, because they're just seeing that this happens. Kids get interested in church history because it's old and it feels really grounding, and then sometimes you lose them. So I was raised in a church that was Lutheran. It was an Alchemist church, and I love the church that I was raised in. It did not emphasize Lutheran identity at a high level. Confirmation was from the catechism, but it wasn't we didn't know that's what it was. They didn't say that this is the Lutheran catechism. It was the handouts. And now I know, looking at it, that's what it is. But it just wasn't, the distinctives weren't highlighted. So it was a very good, I will say, one of the best things about that church is that at all the kids there was a high level of biblical literacy. High. The kids in high school knew the Bible well enough to study Revelation and not get too lost with the cross references and stuff. So that's pretty good. But at the same end, there were a lot of great examples of adults who were living out the faith and role models for kids. So there's some really good things. But in my mid-20s, I had several friends and family members who did become Roman Catholic, who I had grown up with at that church. And they had questions about church history, about liturgy, the answers had not been provided for them. And at that point, when that was happening, I had already attended this place, Concordia, Wisconsin, for undergrad. And my husband was at seminary, and we were in St. Louis. And so at that point, we had a much more robust understanding of the Lutheran tradition than we had like 5 years ago and 5 years before. And I felt very sure that the questions and the faith, like concerns that they had would have been answered very well and very beautifully from a Lutheran tradition, but that they didn't have access to that. And so they couldn't find it, or didn't know where to look for it, or didn't know it was there. And so that became like a passion for me. And this is when I started studying church history, because I realized I didn't know enough about church history to respond to the specific truth claims. In this case of the Roman Catholic Church, but it could be any other faith tradition. I mean, Rome is just their king at the marketing, right? Of the you're very old and you want to. That's what they do, and they're very good at it. But so I had these specific questions then, like, is it true? Do they have an unbroken string of names going all the way back to St. Peter? And if they do have it, what does that mean? Does it mean what they say it means, or does it mean something else? Was the church really united for 1,517 years until Martin Luther ruined the world? Or is there anything more complicated going on there that we might want to understand? And when exactly did the papacy start? Is it, 30 AD or 300 or 600 or 1,000? Like, what's going on? So I didn't know any of the answers to that. I am also just the kind of person who loves school. And so I was going to get a master's degree anyway, because that's kind of what I do. I myself. So I was like, all right, I'm going to find out more about church history. So I worked on that in my master's, and now I'm working on a PhD, and I found really great answers to my burning questions, and I feel like I have my mind wrapped around those specific things that drove me into the study, but there's always more to learn, and there's always more encouragement. And one of the side effects I found of studying church history myself is that it deeply encouraged me in my faith in a way that I wasn't expecting. I thought it would give me oh, this is what such and such person should have known before they made this life decision. But it actually made me feel much less anxious about the future of the world, the future of the church. It made me feel just like a problem comes up in our congregation, and I look at it and I smile and I'm like, oh yeah, that's happened before. And I have like some random story from church history. And I was like, oh, that's great. Okay, that's happened before. But it's encouraging. It keeps you kind of grounded. So then when I started to realize, okay, pause before I go on. As an illustration of one of these moments of like comfort, I was studying early church fathers and their view and their ecclesiology, which is hard to do because for a number of reasons. But anyway, I was reading Basil of Caesarea, and he was bemoaning the state of the church. Okay, like he was like kind of anxious about what the church isn't going to endure. It's a mess. He's dealing with like Arianism and other heresies and things, and he describes the situation that he sees in his church. He says, the doctrines of true religion are overthrown. The laws of the church are in confusion. The ambition of men who have no fear of God rushes into high posts and exalted office is now publicly known as the prize of the piety. There's no knowledge of canons. There's complete immunity in sinning. For when men have been placed in office by the favor of men, they're obliged to return the favor by continually showing indulgence to offenders. That sounds pretty relatable, right? And so here is someone from 400 years into church history, or less, the 4th century, 300 years in. And he's saying, I don't know if the church is going to survive. It looks really rough right now, culturally. And we're like 1,600 years later. And so I just smile and I think, oh, well, either Jesus will come back tomorrow, or 1,000 years from now, people will be like, oh, they have the church. That's kind of funny. Yeah. Clearly it's still here. Because we know the church will be here until Jesus returns. So, anyway, so a couple examples. Now what I want to do is show some examples of ways that the story of church history is challenged that kids will encounter. I have a couple different cult examples. We see heresies return over and over. So for example, Arianism, there's always been these, Arian, does everyone know what Arianism is? So Arianism is the heresy that Jesus is a lesser God than God the Father, right? That he was created, not begotten of all eternity, but came to existence at a specific time and is lower. So, but here's an example of just like the Mormon argumentation that they try to use, like when they're trying to draw people in, right? And so they make these specific claims, which may look on the surface like they're not about church history, but they kind of are about church history, right? So they'll say, 1, the Mormon Church alone has the marks of Christianity. 2, Christianity is an open apostasy. So we have the true teaching. This is not it. And then the outward success of the Mormon Church in the face of persecution proves that it's the restoration of true biblical Christianity. So there's some specific things that if you are well versed in church history, this is not at all compelling, right? Or even maybe just logic or but anyway. So but like this is very prevalent, and then I also wanted to, and then another cult that you don't always think of as a cult is queer theory. So if you've read the book, I don't know, what is it called? Blanking out. The Queering of the American Child. It's a book about showing how queer theory is a cult and the way in which it's taken over the education system and certain institutions over the past 20 years. But I studied this in a class that I was taking this last semester and thought it was strikingly interesting how similar the approach was in argumentation to the Mormon cult narrative. So, you'll hear people say things like, well, you think you were raised Christian, but isn't Jesus all about love, acceptance, and withholding judgment? Right? Like, that, you don't have it quite right. Like, your version of Christianity you were raised with is real. The version of Christianity that shapes the Western world is apostasy. Jesus would hate what the church has become. We've seen that online in the last 24 hours, too. Right? It's like every other thing. And then here, same exact argument, persecution validates, right? Transgenderism must be real because no one would willingly sign up for life of such miserable oppression. The sheer number of LGBTQ people in the face of persecution proves you're right. So these are examples of specific heresies coming back. But if you know the heresies and you know what was seductive about those heresies in the specific eras of church history, you can see how those things are tempting and draw people in the same way today. I don't have time to really flesh that out, but just want to throw those up as examples. Let's see. So church history, basically, I would say is kind of a soft apologetic for the institutional church. And this is very important in a day and time when institutions are seen in a negative light in general. And so church history shows that, the church has been, is not always perfect. There are lots of churches that have done, harmful things, but when you zoom out, you look at it as a whole, it looks very different than the specific problems or hurt that happen in individual places and times. So we all, young adults especially, but all of us have big questions that lead us to question the institutional church at times or question things about church history. Things like, how do we know our denomination is the right one? How do we know which books should be in the Bible? That's a very important question in a sola scriptura or church body. It may seem like a side question, but it's crucial because this is where our theology is coming from. Which denomination is the oldest? Wouldn't the oldest probably be the best one? Does it matter how things have always been done? Should we change something back? Should we keep it the way? How do we evaluate that? Is the oldest way always the best? When should the church do things the way they've always been done? And when should the church change course? Those kinds of questions. There's so many others we could talk about questions people have about church history forever. But I don't think we always realize that what we're asking is a question that can be answered by church history because we're not used to thinking that way. But once you have a framework for church history, you see that a lot of the questions that the people have do have some pretty concrete answers. Okay, so it is my personal conviction that Lutherans need to make more loud, brazen church history claims. We need to say things like Lutheranism is the Western Church, or like Lutheranism is the oldest faith tradition, albeit questionably named, perhaps. We're not good at marketing, but it goes all the way back. That kind of thing. I always think of this scene comes to my mind all the time when I think about Lutheranism and church history, which is ironic because, of course, Tolkien is Catholic. But so in this scene, Aragorn they have just met him, and his name is Strider. He's very sketchy, and he's wearing all this dark stuff, and it looks kind of scary. But he's sent by Gandalf, and he's supposed to help them, and they're not really sure if they should trust him or not. And Frodo, who's the main character with the quest, right, says, I think a servant of the enemy would look fairer and feel fouler. And I think about this all the time. I don't know why this quote comes to my head when I think of the LCMS. I don't know why. I think, some church bodies look very fair, and they have very old buildings and excellent artwork and really good branding and a very coherent message that draws you in and convinces you they're the oldest faith tradition. And then we're over here so Aragorn is actually the king, but it doesn't look like it because he's not doing that right now. He is actually, but you can't tell. And that's kind of the way Lutheran theology is, right? It's actually right, but it's sort of patrolling the northern realm in a hooded cape instead of, I don't know. But anyway, so that's kind of how I think of it. I don't know. But so let me just kind of an overarching framework for church history. If you don't teach your kids any church history and they are left to figure it out on their own, at some point they will be given an understanding of church history that looks roughly like this. So there's the ancient church, then that turns into the medieval church, then in 1054 the church splits into East and West. And then, we get the Protestants, and now there's 20, 30, 40, however many thousand different church bodies that we're saying there are today. This is just sort of what is automatically assumed. Now, history is an art, right? It's not like a science. Was anybody in Dr. O's presentation? Yeah, so it's an art, it's storytelling. It's taking all these things that we know and all these old works and the writings of people who've gone before, and it's framing it into a story that is compelling and that is relevant and that the person listening to it is a part of it. That's history. And so whenever you do that, whoever does it is going to be biased because that's just the way it works. And that doesn't mean you can't eliminate, you can be very honest and you can be objective, and all of those things are important, but whoever it is who teaches our kids church history is going to be sharing a story with them about it. So a Lutheran understanding of church history looks a little more like this, right? So we got the ancient church, which becomes the medieval church, and we have the Great Schism and the Eastern and the Western church. We have the Reformation, which leads to the Lutheran churches and the other Protestant churches. And then you have the Council of Trent and the Roman Catholic Church, which I would argue that, and I'm not thinking that this is my idea, but that the Roman Catholic Church is new. It doesn't go back further than Trent. I mean, certainly there are traditions and things that were in development through the Middle Ages that became formalized and required to be believed. But as an example, when Martin Luther, during the Reformation, the doctrine of purgatory had only been officially stated as dogma in the church for less than 100 years. And so when Luther challenges it, that's reason, we're still kind of allowed to challenge stuff that happened in the 1950s, right? You could say I think you guys are wrong about that. It's not this radical claim. And that's what it was like in timeline for him. Anyway, so I think, let me pause for a second. Does anyone have any questions or comments before we go? Yeah.
Couldn't you even break down the Roman Catholic Church passed after the Council of Trent to the Vatican II?
So you could.
Because
Well,
they
it
had, there
continues
was
to
another
change.
form of reformation in their word.
Yeah, I think the reason I didn't do that is because there's not like another one that stayed. You know, like institutionally, it's united.
Gotcha.
So, and of course, I'm trying to kind of keep it simple. Like I could put what these other Protestant churches are
Sure.
in there, but I was just trying to keep it as sort of streamlined as I could. Yeah. So let me see. Yeah. So I think we're gonna move on now to kind of the how. So what I kind of recommend, and I'm not like an expert in church history. I'm working on it, but like there's a lot there. I'm at the point where I realize that there's more I don't know. Like it's fun. I know very little because like there's too much. But here's a few of my sort of practical thoughts: how not to teach church history. So our why is going to inform our how. So the purpose behind why we're studying church history is going to impact how we want to do it. And for me, I think the purpose is to be encouraged in the faith, to know how the church has come to be where she is today, to know what we should grasp with gratitude and never let go, and to have a good sense of what is incidentally and culturally bound versus what is scriptural and binding for all time. Like we want to kind of have a good sense of those things. So here's some. I don't think you should study church history as like pure moralism, right? So we shouldn't take like specific stories of church fathers or martyrs and turn them into like simplistic moralistic tales for children. Like you should do this and be like this person. Like there's an element of that. I'm not discounting that because like they are role models and examples, but their story isn't about what great people they were. It's about God's faithfulness. And so we want to hold those things in attention. We want to give them those stories, so we don't want to like be afraid to tell the truth about people if they were imperfect or did or said anything that was embarrassing. Because then when our kids go and they hear church history from somebody else, they'll be like, tell me that so-and-so also fill in the blank. And then that will lead them to question. So we want to be very honest and we want to tell people stories with integrity. On the flip side of that, we don't want to do the reverse, which is like this gratuitous fault finding, where it's like nobody gets to be an example, and everybody's like has something in a skeleton in their closet, right? There are lots of people in church history that I disagree with about things, right? So, like in the book, I talk about John Calvin and Wesley, and these other people who, like theologically, they're not in the same theological boat, but I tell their stories as graciously and positively as possible because they are part of the Christian Church Plus. And so, the Eighth Commandment applies, and we are going to talk about them with respect. So they were trying to do something, they were in a context, and maybe they did a good job or not. I like to think of the church fathers and the theologians, those people, they're like our grandparents in the faith, right? So we want to be interested in their stories because they shape us and who we are, and we want to treat them with the kind of respect that we treat our own grandparents and great-grandparents. Were they perfect? Maybe not. But, what can you say about them that is good? So then, proof texting the church fathers. I don't know how else to put that, but this is when you cherry pick church history and like you find a grab quote from somebody that sounds a lot like something you're wanting to prove that the church has always taught, and you just give it in isolation as like evidence for this argument over here that you're building, which is just bad practice in any field. But I put this in here because you will see this a lot in resources. This happens just a ton. I've seen some books when I was looking for a book to teach church history with my kids. A few of the ones I picked up. We're doing this, we're like, Augustine didn't fill the blank. There's like one sentence from him that sounds like that. Like, okay, but that argument, that conversation about that theological topic is happening 1,000 years later, and that's not what he was talking about. So you need to know what they're actually talking about. And certainly it's fair to say, for example, well, did the early church fathers teach justification by faith alone? And then to go into their writings and read what they said and see if you think they taught it. That's a good idea. But, you want to be careful of people like saying, okay, this is what the papacy is, for example, it's their definition. And I can find this sentence over here that really looks like it. And so they have that. They have the same idea. That's not good history. And then again, like the dry list of facts, which we all kind of like. We have that like the stereotype of history. And I think that that's why if people don't like history, they're thinking of like a list of things of like dates or something, because history is really storytelling. And it's, and so that is really how I wanted to approach it. So why I wrote Journey Through Church History specifically, as I kind of already shared, I realized how great church history was for my faith, for my understanding of Lutheranism and where it fits into the world. And I wanted to make sure that my kids knew it. So then I started looking at books that teach church history to kids, and they just weren't Lutheran enough. I mean, so they, either they would select people that I was like, that's not the right selection. Or I think the thing about writing for kids, actually, for children, is that when we simplify things for our kids, our bias comes out much stronger than in like adult or more academic resources. So when you can just say, here's, 50 pages of facts about this situation, then you don't have to interpret it to the reader. They get to read it, and they're doing all the interpretation themselves. It's going to be less biased than when you say to your kids, when you describe what the Council of Trent was in 2 sentences. That's going to be the most biased version of what the Council of Trent is that there is, for example. And so I think that sometimes we have this idea in our heads that, like, we can use more ecumenical and general resources for kids because we're teaching them general things at this low level. But actually, because we're simplifying it, they're getting I would say usually a heavier dose of bias from whatever the perspective is of the person who's writing that. So like children's Bibles and things like that, this definitely applies, I think. So I personally read lots of books written not by Lutherans about church history all the time, and I don't have any issue with that at all. But for my kids, for their very first exposure, I wanted to frame it, and I wanted to give them that overarching story. So then I also wanted it to be very engaging and relatable. So I wanted it to create sort of a framework so that when they study more in high school and beyond, that they know where these people fit, so when they're assigned, Augustine's Confessions, they have some concept of what's going on in church history, of what Augustine was facing at that time, and also like the impact that Augustine had later in other eras. And so, and I put in here a table. This is the table of contents from the leader guide, but you can see the list of chapter names there to give you an idea of sort of the scope and sequence that I decided to go with. People always ask me, how did you decide like which church fathers to include and which not to include? And I didn't like pick these people because I think they're the most important. Like there's a lot of people who are not included who are important. These are definitely people who are quite important and who I wanted them to name recognition for. Sometimes I would have to leave somebody out because I had already covered that topic that they addressed or that era and a different story. And so I just, for space, was not able to include everybody that I would have liked. But so mostly you can see most of the chapters are named after individuals and tell like a sort of hopefully a gripping or interesting story from that person, as well as like an overview of their setting, what was going on in the church at that time and their theology. But then I also have these topical chapters interspersed every 5-ish or so chapters that cover those big questions, like where did the Bible come from, what books are in it, how does the canon work, where do the creeds come from, where does the liturgy come from, where do denominations come from, which is positioned kind of at the Great Schism, and then what's the Book of Concord, and I included a chapter on like the beginning of the LCMS, because I was like, hey, I'm writing this book for my kids, so why not tell them, bring them right up to like where they are contextually. Now I will say I actually have friends who are Baptists who are using this book with their kids, and they're totally fine with it, and they're learning a lot because they don't know any of the early church fathers, and that's all new. And then when they get to the later part that's like post-Reformation, they have a lot of resources for that era already. But they've been really excited to have just a Protestant position with all of these early church fathers, because most of the resources that give you those stories are Roman Catholic. So I have this. One of the goals for the book itself was to be able to read each chapter aloud in 10 to 12 to 15 minutes. And so I don't know if I think I succeeded in that. And then there's also a leader guide, which you can use if you homeschool or in a school setting. And for each chapter, the leader guide has 4 additional pages. So you can expand it into a fuller lesson if you want. So there's vocabulary words from the chapter that the kids can go, those are in bold in the book, so they can go look them up and see what they mean. There's a Bible study that connects to the themes from the chapter, but it's like a Bible study. I didn't put the teacher page up here, it just gives the answer to the Bible study. And then I've got a student page for older students that always has like a map, which shows the locations from whatever was discussed in the chapter. A copy work passage, if copy work is something that they're doing and that would be helpful. Those are usually either from the church father or from scripture or a hymn or something like that that's connected. And then there's like one additional activity which varies for each chapter that's like a digging deeper or an exploring, like a quiz or something fun. And then every chapter has a coloring page, which is my favorite part of the reader guide, because when I'm reading it to my kids, I always make copies of those and then they all color while I read. And that works really well because their hands are busy, and so that has helped us a lot. So this book has been out for a year now, and I know a lot of schools are using it. I've heard like 5th all the way through 8th that I've heard of teachers and families that they're using it, and I've seen some Sunday school classes and information age kids too. So I hope that it's helpful for school. I think to kind of end, well, we're doing great. Okay. So in terms of church history, I have these goals for my own children, what I want them to have by the end of high school. These are sort of like bare minimum goals, which are, we're very ambitious in classical education. Like the list of things we'd love for our kids to have by the end of high school is lengthy and all wonderful. And, that's some kids are going to be able to get through more than others because we're all different. But so this is kind of what I've got, and you might have your own, and this may change because I don't have a kid in high school. So I reserve the right to change my mind because I've learned that you don't know what you don't know until you find out. So first is just name recognition for major church fathers, for the ecumenical councils, for an understanding of how church history fits into world history. And that's kind of what I tried to do in the Church History book. Second goal is to read through the Book of Concord and understand both its historical context and the systematic theology in it. So that I think is quite attainable in high school. And I really like the CPH's reader's version because it has some really great intro material for each of the items and each of the confessions in the Book of Concord. I also teach an online class for homeschool students where we do the Lutheran confessions, the high schoolers. And I have one of those starting up in the fall. So if anybody has a high schooler who is interested in taking Lutheran confessions this fall, we still have some space in that, and I have the syllabus if you want to look at it. But yeah, I have them read the whole Book of Concord, and I teach them about, before they read the selection for the week, I preview the historical context and the theology that they're going to encounter in it and frame it for them. And then they read it, and then we discuss it, and we see the next. So I've done this a couple times, and it's so fun. It is just my favorite thing to do is talk about the Book of Concord with high school students. And then exposure to primary sources. So that I only put that third, not because it's the least important, but because it's sometimes harder. Not always. Some primary sources are quite accessible and pretty easy to read, and some are a little bit more challenging. So I do have a reading list over there, which is just sort of some books that I recommend if you are kind of wondering what you might want to use for yourself to learn worship history or if your kid is short. I try to keep it short because sometimes I think that's not helpful because you can always go online and find a long list of things to read. But yeah. So I feel like with the Book of Concord, that it's really good. Highly recommend it. I know I probably don't need to say that here, but I think that if you wait until your kid is already like emotionally invested in a different faith tradition, and then you try to get them to read the Book of Concord in personal experience, it's a little late. And so I want them to have it in high school. I want them to know the full richness of what Lutheran has to offer before they fall in love with somebody who's not Lutheran. I don't know. I just want them to have it. And that's not to say, I could qualify that a lot, but that's just so. All right. So kind of to conclude, church history is deeply encouraging. It has encouraged me so much in my faith. I love studying it and I love sharing it with kids. That's why I wrote this particular book. Yeah, so I'm happy to answer questions. Yeah, I understand.
We're in having a student.
Oh, great.
Hey, process. Not start to back.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have that laid out in your process?
So the way I do it, I could always change this. Well, I'm interested to know what his way is, but
It's pre-COVID when I had that, so
Okay.
my memory is gone since then.
I can tell you how I do it, and it may not be the best way or the only way, but it makes sense to me. So I start out with a historical overview of the Reformation sort of high level to frame it. Then I have a week where we talk about scripture versus tradition and get very clear about, and so we have some supplemental readings then and talk about the different frameworks for tradition as an authority versus sola scriptura and make sure we really understand what sola scriptura means and what it doesn't mean. Then we do the history of the creeds, because the creeds are in the Book of Concord, so we spend a week on those. And then I intersperse the Augsburg Confession and the Apology because I want to be able to talk about the systematic theology topics. So I assign like a set of articles from the Augsburg Confession with the corresponding ones from the Apology. So we read those, talk about those topics. So we spent something like 6 weeks on those two together. I have a week that we talk about purgatory and indulgences, where we're not reading from the Book of Concord. I have a Chemnitz expert that they can read if they want it. But I basically give them the history of the development of the doctrine of purgatory and indulgences, how that came to be over time. Yeah.
I was in the same class as he was.
Yeah.
What Dr. Mays did was that he was coming at a historical perspective. So the first session is 4 sessions engaged. The first one was a historical context.
Yeah.
What was going on around it? Why was the emperor so concerned? Was overarching all of this, and that's why it caused a lot of this is because the church is coming.
Yeah.
So you got that historical perspective, which puts a certain aspect of urgency to why all was going on at the same time. So he did it historically.
Yeah.
So he took it through.
Like in the order they were written.
In order that it was written, in order to be able to lay it out why this was done, this was response, this was the counter response.
I can see the value in that, and I might do that someday. I kept them roughly in the order they are. Well, basically, I mean, they're kind of in the order they're written in, with the exception of the small and large catechisms, which I have in the second semester, and that's mostly because the kids already know the small catechisms well when I get them, and I want to start with something they don't know to make sure it really hooks their interest and are doing something that they have not seen before. And so that's kind of why I chose to do that, but I certainly see the value in that. And one of the sort of tricky things about the confessions class is that you can go with the, like, predominantly we're doing history of the Reformation through the Book of Concord, or you can go, we're doing the Book of Concord and we're including history. But with high schoolers, like, there's so much material there. You have to, like, I'm kind of giving the theology of the Book of Concord a higher billing in our time. So I want to make sure that we really understand, like, the transubstantiation specifically, and what the difference is, what, like, so I wanted to make sure I got that. Because, but there's so much, so we
The
do.
interesting thing was that it was actually a Board of Elders retreat.
Mhm.
So they held the first one with just the Board of Elders, and the congregation almost went up because they all wanted to be taught that too. So it was opened up to the entire church,
Right.
and we had a lot of people come.
Yes. So my husband always says that the Book of Concord is our anti-cult device, right? Like, this is how your pastor should be teaching this. And so if you know what it's in it, you know if your pastor's teaching it or not. And like, that the pastor doesn't get to decide, like, this is the authority. And so you don't get swept away by a charismatic leader. Yeah, so I do think that, everyone should. Does anyone have any questions about the church history book, journey through, or whatever, that's fine.
Sort of about the Book of Concord. You said one of the how not to teach church history, but proof texting. And I know that you don't have a lot of testimonies of proof texting, but could you just say something about, like, what is different about that from proof texting? Maybe you do think this.
Well, no, I don't think that. I guess proof texting works if you're, like, right, I guess. But, that's a good point. There's sort of a place for, I think what I want to say about that is more that it's important to teach your kids out of their radar up for that kind of thing, so that they see it and they know when something is being, so I know that the writers of the Book of Concord did a lot of citing the church fathers, but how did they do it? And had they actually read the whole thing? Yeah. I mean, Melanchthon had read all of everything he quoted. And I don't think that he intentionally took anything out of context for polemical reasons. One of my favorite things about being right is that you don't have to hide any of the data. And so, like, you can cite anything and it's gonna, like, that's an advantage. But, so I think that the key is, we have really good ways to teach anything we want to teach from the actual, like, we can support the thesis with integrity, so we don't have to take a shortcut and say, hey, looks like this quote kind of says what we want. But if we haven't read the whole thing, we don't need that shortcut, because we can just find a scholar, find a seminary professor, ask them what actually makes that point. But does that?
Yeah.
So my question is actually about the journey through church history book. You guys said most of the day schools are doing it, like, 5th through 8th grade that you're aware of?
Fourth grade.
Okay. That's why I was wondering about the appropriateness of grades younger than 5th.
Yes. So I think you can do it at whatever level. I read it to my kids, and my 7-year-old was pretty engaged. I think some of it went over her head, but she wasn't bored, so she was tracking. So she's going into 3rd. That's kind of young. I would say 4th is fine.
My 4th graders, that was one of the things they read out loud. I convinced my headmaster to buy it as a supplement to our history curriculum, because we use Veritas and it's got some bias. And it's the fall of Rome to the Reformation, so it fit really well with that. And so this was our special supplement, and they would get really excited because they're like, are we going to get a heresy today? Maybe don't tell people that. They're going to be in trouble.
It was very fun to read with the kids. They enjoyed it. There's, like, themes that come back in a lot of the chapters. So, like, in the early part, like, the church fathers always, like, running away and trying not to be made bishop. Like, this is a theme that comes through. Nobody wants to be bishop, so they, like, run off, and then people chase them and grab them and bring them back and ordain them as bishop. And my son, who's super into chess, he would always go, ugh. Every time someone became bishop, he'd be like, now they can name diagonal. This became this like silly running.
My kids wanted to make trading cards for their favorite heresies, and I was like, maybe their favorite church father.
Okay, but that's, you know, I'm glad they know what heresies are.
They're like, oh my god,
Any other questions? Okay, so I'm gonna be up at the CPH table for this afternoon, so there, and the books are over there, so if you wanna flip through and look at one, or get one signed or whatever, I'll be up there after this. This is the leader guide. Oh, yeah, so there's a leader guide, and you don't need a leader guide if you don't want to. Stop.